Welcome to the Theological Lens, where our goal is to see the world, our daily walks, and our worship transformed by the truth of Jesus Christ. Our content is saturated with Scripture, overflowing with faith, and rooted in the good news of the cross. Each episode will proclaim the name of the Lord, calling us to submit to His ways and live lives that glorify Him. With hearts full of thankfulness, we'll explore how Jesus shapes everything, our decisions, our worldview, and our worship, always pointing back to the hope and transformation found in Him.
Hello, and welcome to the Theological Lens. My name is Dr. Linnell Buchanan, and I'm so glad that you've joined me today. For the last several weeks, our topics have varied widely. Some have been driven by current events, others by topics that I was speaking on in other environments, and still others were driven by my own personal grief journey. But today, what we're going to talk about is something that I just find endlessly fascinating. I don't know if you'll agree with me, but I hope that you will stick with me to the end because you might get to a rant by the end that maybe it'll pay off. I have always loved the study of personality. It's looking at the individual variations that God has made in human beings, and it's really fun to consider those things. And an interesting extension of those individual variations is that we can start to see patterns emerge in generations. And those generational trends and personality dynamics show us some fascinating differences. Understanding these differences can give us some great insight about why different generations seem to function in such disparate ways. So researchers have been unpacking these generational differences for many decades, and it has resulted in some conceptualization of each generation and its strengths and some of its weaknesses. And that has allowed us to have some longitudinal comparisons. So to start us off today, I want to talk about the things that we think we understand about some of the different generations and what they're known for and what their strengths and maybe some of their weaknesses are, because I'm going to build on this. And then I hope that you'll stick with me to see how this ends up coming together at the end. So I'm going to start with baby boomers. There's generations before the baby boomers, but this is the ones that we're most familiar with, the ones that we see in the largest groups of people today. And the boomers actually were born between 1946 and 1964. The core traits of the baby boomers were really like a work ethic and a deep, deep loyalty. They valued hard work, they valued diligence, and they were organizationally loyal. Many of them would work for one employer throughout their entire career. They were optimistic and idealistic, and that stemmed from some of the things that they experienced coming of age post-war and in the middle of some big social movements like the 60s. They were face-to-face communicators, and they, to this day, prefer individual personal interaction. And so they are very much less reliant on digital tech than any other generation alive today. And then their identity was often tied to their career. They defined their success through achievement and also through job stability across their lifespan. So the cultural context that shaped the baby boomers was very much the civil rights movement, the Vietnam War, the space race, even the revolution that came through television. Following the baby boomers was Generation X. And they had had such creative names for generations until they got to this one. And this one actually happens to be mine. Gen Xers were born sometimes between 1965 and 1980. You can guess where I fall in that little range right there. But the core traits of the Gen Xers are, first of all, independence and resourcefulness. And they were latchkey kids. So many of them had to learn self-sufficiency because they were the first main generation where mothers were often working outside the home. They ended up very skeptical of authority, and that might have been because they experienced some political scandals and corporate downsizing and less corporate loyalty to the employees. They started to have more of a focus on work-life balance than the boomers ever had, valuing some autonomy and flexibility more than being loyal to one company throughout their career. And they are kind of considered the tech bridge generation. They might have been born in an analog time, but they had to adjust rather quickly. And so they've had a digital adulthood. In the cultural context, the Gen Xers experienced the end of the Cold War, the rise of personal computing, MTV in its glory days, and also some pretty significant economic shifts. Following Generation X are what is known as the millennials. The millennials were born sometime between 1981 and 1996. The core traits for the millennials include they're collaborative, very purpose driven, and seeking meaning and impact in their big life decisions, in the work that they choose. It wasn't just about show me the money; it was about show me the meaning, and that's a great thing. Millennials tend to be very tech savvy, very connected. They were the first kind of digital natives. Social media has defined very much of their lives. And then they're experience oriented. They tend to value travel and flexibility and self expression over just material goods. They were educational focused, which means they're also financially strained. A huge percentage of the millennial generation went to college, accrued a great deal of collegiate debt, and have had a hard time paying that off and entering the workforce post recession. We really saw the values hit with the millennials. They were the first to introduce things like ethically caught tuna or ethically sourced coffee. And the generations before didn't care about that. They just wanted to know which was the least expensive or the highest quality. And here comes the millennials saying, but we care about how it happens. So their cultural context really was 9/11. The Great Recession of 2008 impacted them, and the rise of the internet and social media, and also smartphones, which were very ubiquitous in their experience. So following the millennials, we get to Gen Z. And Gen Z falls somewhere between 1997 and 2012. So following the millennial generation, we have Gen Z. That doesn't have a creative name. Again, we're back to that same nonsense with Gen X. But Gen Z, they were born sometime between 1997 and 2012. The core traits that we've identified with Gen Z are, first of all, they are the true digital natives. They never knew a world without the internet or without mobile devices. They're individualistic, yet also they tend to be somewhat inclusive. Like they value diversity, authenticity, self expression is something that is so important to Gen Z. And they are very, very aware of mental health dynamics. They openly discuss anxiety, identity, emotional wellness. That's just part of the conversation and part of the reality that they understand and communicate about. They tend to be very entrepreneurial. They value flexibility, so they want to be self-employed. They want to be content creators. They want to be people who run their own lives, run their own careers. And then they're very, very socially conscious. What started with the millennials as wanting an ethically sourced product has really turned into Gen Z expecting all of the companies to act in a way that they view as ethical and responsible. So that control over those things has just gotten more and more that value-based thing. The cultural context that has shaped Gen Z is very much the dominance of social media, climate activism, which is a big deal, school shootings, COVID-19, all of those variables have been very influential in shaping Gen Z. And that takes us to Gen Alpha. And Gen Alpha was born after 2013. And these are the little ones that are running around in our world up through maybe some junior hires. And what we're seeing in regards to their emerging core traits, obviously there's much still to be discovered about them, are things like the fact that they are both AI and screen immersed. This is just part of the whole of their existence. They grew up with voice assistants. They grew up with smart tech. They grew up with AI companions, things that were so foreign to us in our experience. They're very global and also visual learners. They like video-based education, digital interactivity, and they're very aware of what's happening on a global scale in ways that no generation before them has ever been. We are seeing with them early socialization and customization. They expect personalization in everything because everything has been shaped to fit them. And then we're also seeing high parental involvement with this generation. They're being raised by millennials, and that means there is a heavy focus on emotional intelligence and emotional communication. We see that sometimes in the gentle parenting trends. So the cultural context that has shaped them are pandemic era education, the AI boom that is taking over our world, and also this climate urgency, these panics related to things that are happening on a global scale. Honestly, we're just hoping that Gen Alpha gets over this 6-7 thing. That was my pop culture reference for the day. I hope you enjoyed it. Now, these generational traits have emerged because this group of people developed, came of age, whatever, during unique points in time. And the larger experiences of that time period are affecting everyone within the generation. Since personality is formed through both nature influences like genetics and also nurture influences like environment, those shared cultural moments have the significant power in impacting an entire generation. Now, some recent research has honed in on considering the differences between generations from the perspective of the big five personality traits. Now, these main five personality constructs originated from the work of Cattell, and then they were fleshed out a little bit more in the 1960s. So, most researchers agree that these are five pretty relatively stable continuums that provide a good assessment of the differences in people and how they approach the world around them. So, let me offer you, first of all, I'm going to go over these big five traits, and then we're going to dig into how these personality variables like differ across generations, how we're seeing changes occur across generations. And then we're going to explore what this means for our lives. What are some applications that we can take away from this? Think in workplaces, in schools, and even in family constructs. So let's kick things off with that main foundation, the big five personality traits. Now, these are sometimes referred to with the OCEAN acronym, or some people will use the CANOE acronym, but I'm going to use OCEAN for the sake of what we're doing today. And that's because each of these five variables starts with the first letter that is in the word ocean. So the first five variables, these five variables, are considered the standard for understanding personality. The first one would be openness to experience. Now, the expectation is that we could give you an assessment like the Big Five inventory, or we could give you the NEOPI, and you would answer some questions about how you relate to your world. And then you would end up somewhere on this continuum from very, very low to very, very high on each of these traits. So openness to openness to experience is made up of several other subscales that when you combine them, you get the big score for openness to experience. And those subscales are about fantasy. Do you have good imagination, daydreaming? The second one would be about aesthetics. Do you appreciate art and beauty? Is that something that you value and enjoy? The third one would be feelings. Are you open to inner emotional experiences as well? The fourth one would be actions. Are you open to new and exciting activities? The fifth one would be ideas. Do you have an intellectual curiosity? The sixth one would be value. Are you open to re-examine your social or political or your religious values? And after you answered all of those questions, you would show up somewhere on this continuum. Very low, low, moderate, high, very high. And people who are high are probably people who we would describe as curious or imaginative or artistic. And people who are very low are probably people we would think of as conventional or practical or preferring of routine. If you love trying new foods and you love chasing the latest trends, you're probably high in openness to experience. But if you like to stick with what you know, maybe you're not so high in that continuum. Everybody falls somewhere in there. The second of the big five personality traits, as represented by OCEAN, would be conscientiousness. And conscientiousness is about organization, and it's about discipline, and it's about focus on a goal. So the subscales that are part of this trait are things like competence. Do you have a good sense of self-efficacy? Do you have a confidence in your own abilities? The second one would be order. Do you have a preference for neatness, organization? The third one would be dutifulness, a sense of moral obligation or responsibility. The fourth one would be achievement striving. Are you competitive? Do you want to win? Do you want to pursue excellence? The fifth one would be self-discipline, persistence, follow through in completing tasks, even the hard ones. The sixth one would be deliberation. Are you careful? Are you a planner? Do you think ahead before you act? And when you put all of those together, you're going to be somewhere between very low to very high. People who are really high in conscientiousness, we'd probably describe as reliable or hardworking or very thorough. And people who are very low in conscientiousness, we would probably describe as spontaneous or disorganized, maybe a little chaotic or unreliable. So high scorers are probably the folks with color-coded planners, and the low scorers probably not so much. Probably go with the flow are the low scorers. So that takes us to the third of the constructs in the big five, and that one is extroversion. Now, most of us have gotten a sense of extroversion somewhere from our pop culture, somewhere from the influences that are around us. And we know the extroverts are the social butterflies and introverts are the quiet ones sitting at home with their cats. But when we look at extroversion, we're talking about not just sociability, but also assertiveness is in there. And even there's some energy stuff in there too. So the facets that they consider in regards to extroversion are warmth. Are people friendly and affectionate towards others? Gregariousness. Do they enjoy and get just rich energy from social interaction? Are they assertive? Do they have like leadership kinds of tendencies? Social dominance is in there. Number 4 would be activity. Their pace of living, their energy level, if that's higher, that's going to contribute more towards extroversion. Number 5, excitement seeking. People who are high extroverts tend to have a great desire for stimulation. I want to do. And then number 6 is positive emotions. They tend to feel joy, satisfaction, enthusiasm, passion, zeal, verb, all of those kinds of great terms. So somebody who's going to be high in extroversion, we would probably describe as outgoing or energetic or expressive. People who are really low in extroversion, we're probably going to describe as reserved or quiet. Maybe we might describe them as independent. This is just kind of about that sociability, that energy, and extroverts tend to be the life of the party, and introverts recharge with a good book and a quiet night. So the fourth of the big 5 variables is agreeableness, and that's compassion, and that's trust, and that's cooperation. And the facets in there include trust in other people's honesty and good intentions, includes straightforwardness, a sincerity or frankness. It includes altruism, a concern for others' welfare. It includes compliance, or a tendency to avoid conflict. Here's where our people pleasers are. It includes modesty and humility instead of self-importance. And then it also includes tender-mindedness and empathy and compassion for others. So people who are high in this agreeableness are probably described as kind or cooperative or empathetic. People who are very low might be described as competitive or critical or even skeptical. And then the last of the big 5 traits, and hold with me now because there's some good stuff coming. Don't get lost in the weeds here. The 5th is neuroticism. And neuroticism is kind of about emotional instability and sensitivity to stress. So the subscales for neuroticism include anxiety, tendency to worry or fear. It includes angry hostility, so a tendency towards irritability. It includes depression. It includes self-consciousness or a sensitivity to social judgment. It includes impulsiveness, maybe a difficulty controlling one's urges. And then it also includes vulnerability. And this might be just a poor tolerance for stress or somebody who is easily overwhelmed. And when we talk about people who are high in neuroticism, we're talking about people who are very emotionally reactive. We might describe them as moody or tense. And if they're low in this area, they're probably calm and resilient. Maybe they're emotionally stable. So the people who are high are going to be anxious, especially under stress, and the people who are low are probably cool as a cucumber at the same time. Now, if you took a few minutes and you thought about it, you might guess at where you would fall, even if I didn't give you one of those assessments. You might say, oh, I know I'm high in extroversion, or I know I'm low in conscientiousness. But what we're going to talk about today is what happens when we look at patterns across an entire generation. Like this, we do by taking those kinds of assessments and then looking at the norms, the average scores. Now, the truth is there's no group where everybody falls into the average. We will always have outliers. So when we're talking about these generational patterns, or we might be talking about your generation, maybe you're the outlier. But I think understanding these averages and where these generations come together and where they differ is so valuable for us in understanding the people around us. So we're not saying that everybody in the generation is like this, but there always will be some trends because it's about context. Boomers had post-war optimism that gave a context in which they were developing, and millennials were dealing with some economic uncertainties, and Gen Z is growing up in hyper-connected kind of world. So these experiences are, of course, shaping how people think and how they act, and even shaping their personalities. And guys, I got to tell you, this is where I find it so interesting. Researchers who have done studies like Jean Twenge, who's done a ton of work on this, and others show some clear differentiation between generational patterns on these big 5 traits. And these shifts come from cultural, economic, tech changes, all of those environmental influences that are shaping people and how they think about the world around them. So, and remember, we're still talking about averages here. Not every boomer or not every Gen Z person fits this perfect mold. But if we go trait by trait, hang with me, because when we get to the end, I think we're going to find some critical insights, some things that will help us as we relate to others. So first, let's talk about openness to experience. When researchers look at this trait by generation, they discover that millennials and Gen Z tend to score higher than boomers and Gen X. So the youngest of us are more open to experience than the oldest of us. This probably shouldn't surprise us. Younger folks grew up in a globalized kind of world, and think how that affects internet and travel and exposure to diverse cultures. And because of that, I think they have had a curiosity and a creativity that has been sparked by those kinds of exposures. Older generations that were raised in more traditional kind of times, they often tend to lean towards what is more familiar, what they're used to. For example, a millennial might be all about trying the latest AI tool, or they might be about traveling to a new country and trying new foods. And a boomer might say, I'm good with my old school methods. Thank you very much. And that might sound like somebody you know. You might think, I know some boomers like that. And that generational difference probably honestly shouldn't surprise us that much. And I don't think the next one will either, because the next step is conscientiousness. Boomers and Gen X, the oldest generation, usually score a much higher than millennials and Gen Z in conscientiousness. Older folks were shaped by like a post-war work ethic. That ethic might have said, show up early, stay late, climb the ladder. Younger generations are a whole lot more about work-life balance. They're about flexibility. So a boomer might be very, very annoyed if a meeting starts 5 minutes late because somebody wasn't here on time. And somebody who is in the younger generation might think, why are we having the meeting in the first place? There's no point to this. We could just do this on our own. So this has resulted in broad frustration in workplace environments. And in fact, we could put up image after image of headline after headline that speaks to the fact that we're not connecting well in workplace environments. Older generations, boomers and Gen Xers who are in management positions, they're responsible for hiring and training these young ones, are frustrated by the millennials, and they're frustrated by the Gen Z employees because they don't seem to have the same kind of work ethic. And of course, this disconnect is gonna create disruptions, especially because the very traits in conscientiousness, those sub traits, are the traits that are so well correlated with success. They're traits like achievement striving and self-discipline and confidence. And if we have a generation that is not as strong in those areas, then it is going to be disruptive in some of those workplace environments. Now, one of the kind of research tangents that is that there are wild outliers to this. There are absolutely millennials and there are absolutely some Gen Z people who have built whole huge empires because they did it their way. They just did it in a different kind of way, a less conventional way than the other generations. And so it almost seems like if they have the opportunity to really explore things in a way that makes sense to them, they do a lot better than in conventional workplace environments where they just frustrate their bosses. So that's an important thing to note. And that same dynamic, that same frustration can happen within the home too, because parents who were taught high levels of conscientiousness and high levels of follow through are very often frustrated with children who can't seem to remember to take out the trash. Why is this so hard? So we'll discuss a little bit more about that in a minute. So that takes us to extroversion. And as the researchers try to sort out these issues related to extroversion, they have found that millennials and Gen Z often score slightly higher in extroversion than Gen X and boomers. But a higher percentage of the young ones still identify as introverts. So even though as a whole, the generation is scoring higher, a huge percentage of them consider themselves introverts. Now, interesting, we know this about millennials and Gen Z. We know they see themselves as introverts because of, wait for it, their social engagement online. Because they tell us that social media and digital platforms make it so much easier for these young ones to network and express themselves. And it gives them a platform so that they can tell people that they don't like people. So that's really fascinating to see how that has fleshed out. They're connected all the time while they scream that they don't like people. So this one's going to be interesting to see how this washes out over time. Now, Gen X with a really broad independent streak and boomers who were more focused on work, they might come off as less outgoing to those who are always connected. But that connection isn't necessarily indicative of a true gregariousness. These younger generations aren't necessarily truly wanting deep, rich relationships as much as they just want constantly to be known. So that's interesting. And this is actually suggests the fact that there isn't a huge difference, but there are some slight differences between the generations, that even with the stark changes in our world, I mean, massive rewriting of the norms of our world, a true generational divide has not evidenced itself in regards to extroversion. So this is out of the big five. This is the one that has the least least quantitative difference between the generations. So then that takes us to agreeableness. And on this one, the data is actually a bit mixed on some of those subscales. But most studies suggest that Gen Z and millennials score higher than boomers. They are more agreeable than boomers and Gen X. Younger generations are big on inclusivity and teamwork. And that's probably thanks to a lot of speaking about diversity and social justice and collaborative technology. Boomers were raised in competitive workplaces, and they might prioritize getting ahead over group harmony. And Gen X, we were absolutely raised feral. So agreeableness was not big on our common traits. The key disconnect in this seems to come down to the fact that older generations are not willing to trust others as lightly, maybe because of bad experiences, or they're not willing to just go along to get along. And maybe the entire cohort scores have been skewed by those Karens that are showing up on our video feeds all the time. Personally, I have a theory that starting with perimenopause, the physiological changes that aging contributes to our world actually creates more crazy. Now, that seems to undermine any agreeableness that we might ever have once had. So maybe perimenopause kills agreeableness. And who knows, maybe down the road, the millennials who face those life changes will then discover a little bit of compassion for the Karens that went before them. So finally, and I think most notably, because we're going to dive into this one pretty deeply, neuroticism shows the most significant generational differences out of any of the big five. And this is so important that this is why I wanted to do this video. Millennials and Gen Z, the young ones among us, they tend to score substantively higher than boomers and Gen X in regards to neuroticism. Remember, this is the emotional instability variable that's full of things like anxiety and depression. And it is just deeply known by the youngest among us, both the millennials, Gen Z, and we're already seeing lots of hints of it in Generation Alpha. So why are these young ones so emotionally untethered? Well, I think that there are several variables that are nursing anxiety in our youth. They are constantly hearing scary messages. Headlines scream that they have it so much harder than previous generations. And I honestly think that my grandparents who lived through the Great Depression and World War, and my parents who navigated the draft, they might want to have a discussion about why this generation thinks they have it worse than anyone else. Yes, the young ones are facing economic insecurities. I get that. But so did every other generation. And yes, there is massive amount of pressure related to social media, but every generation has had social pressures. And some of the fears that these youths have come to hold so tightly are because members of older generations are intentionally trying to scare them, sometimes for political reasons, and because they're easier to control that way. And that can absolutely ramp up anxiety. And the youngest generations are also trying to find their way without many of the advantages that the older generations had as they faced their challenges. When boomers and Gen X ran into difficulties, they had a more stable social structure. Healthy churches, strong communities, intact families, and the high levels of connectivity and access to information. Honestly, I don't think it's helped. Gone are the years of innocence when children didn't have to worry about what was going on halfway across the globe. No wonder the young ones are stressed out. So, what does all of this mean for the real world? Let's talk about how these differences play out in workplaces and schools and relationships. You know, in the workplace, I think these traits shape how we collaborate. Millennials and Gen Z bring fresh, innovative, open ideas. Perfect for creating and sparking change. But they might need some structure to stay on track. And boomers shine in disciplined, structured roles, while millennials are much more concerned about flexible hours. Gen Z's extroversion makes them really great networkers, but it might clash with Gen X's leave me alone vibe. In schools, these traits matter too. Gen Z's openness loves interactive, techie kind of learning. Think like virtual simulations. They love that kind of stuff. But their stress levels mean that the teachers and administrators have to come with understanding and support. Parents, teachers, and even pastors will have to adapt to all of these differences to keep everyone engaged. And in relationships, whether it's with friends or with family, understanding these traits, understanding these differences will actually build empathy and hopefully then collaboration. A boomer's work obsession might frustrate a millennial who's all about purpose. But knowing why they differ helps you to find common ground, like shared goals. So how do we bridge these gaps? Well, I have a few ideas. And the first is that I think we need to set up very intentional cross-generational mentorships. Boomers can teach discipline and millennials can program the remote. The truth is that every generation has strengths and weaknesses. And if we collaborate, we can be so much more effective than if we don't. And it is clearly a better strategy than leading with criticism or shaking our fists at the young whippersnappers. Number two, I think we have to be open to new ways of doing things that might resonate better with the new generation. I know the old ways worked for you, but maybe it doesn't have to be about you. I've watched this play out in a lot of different environments, but most notably, I've watched this play out in churches. Sometimes you have older generations who are so resistant to any change within the church environment. And I really appreciated how my husband approached this as he talked to our senior saints about some changes that we wanted to make in regards to the music in the church. And he sat down with them and he said, I am so grateful that I don't have to worry about you and your faith in God because I know you love the Lord. But I'm worried about your grandchildren. I'm worried about the younger generations that do not seem so concrete in their walk and in their pursuit of God. And I think we have to do our best to reach to them, to help them find their relationship with the Lord, to help them find their love for the Lord. I think that was really helpful. Sometimes our rigidity is just selfishness. Change isn't always bad. And the change that we are resisting might end up being true improvement. I mean, after all, there wasn't always indoor plumbing. Number 3, and probably most importantly, we've got to talk openly about our misunderstandings between generations, because often insights into another person's perspectives can actually diffuse frustration. It's all about meeting people where they are. And I think every generation needs to be more concerned about its own flaws than they are the next generations. And all this reminds me of an early criticism of millennials. I don't know if you remember this, but everyone was so judgy about millennials' need for participation trophies. I get it. That's crazy, right? Except, who's the one who made those trophies and awarded them? It wasn't millennials. It was their parents. It was their teachers, those of a different generation. And some of the same people who created those trophies then complained about the need to award them. That's kind of unfair, isn't it? They needed to look in the mirror, because the responsibility for many of the perceived weaknesses come from the generations that shaped them. In the same way, if we're concerned about the emotional frailty, and I am concerned about the emotional frailty of Gen Z and Gen Alpha, then we have to recognize that these problems are sourced in adults. Adults who have undermined the support systems that these children should have been able to count on. They've done that by turning away from God. They've done that by fostering environments where crime has no consequence. They've done that by refusing to do the hard work of marriage and family. And adults have fear-mongered children, not caring about the emotional toll that it will cost them just because they want to shape the child's political beliefs. Yeah, that's so wrong.
How dare you?
Adults have refused to make hard decisions to protect their kids, when sometimes what they have needed most are some mean parents. Parents, you can say no, even if it seems like you're the only one who's doing it. You can say no to smartphones. You can say no to social media. You can say no to unfettered internet access. You can also say no to gentle parenting. I swear one of these days there's going to end up being a soapbox issue on that one. It is adults who have to make the changes that will strengthen these next generations, that will give them better control over their emotions, and it will save them from the weight of anxiety and depression, because that weight is crippling them. Well, that is my 2 cents on a topic that is probably surprisingly heavy. I would love to hear your comments below. Your perspectives would be appreciated. And until next time, grace and peace to you.
If you enjoyed what you just heard, we invite you to like the episode and, if possible, leave a positive review. If you know someone who could benefit from this content, please share it on your social media. We also ask that you subscribe and follow so that you don't miss any of our upcoming episodes. We are so glad that you chose to be with us today. We hope that you will join us again next week on The Theological Lens.